Welcome, listeners, to One Mission, the podcast. We're glad again to have you and our audience. This is Rick Lance. I'm your host, and today I'm glad to have a dear friend who is also one of our fine Alabama Baptist leaders, Greg Davis. He's the executive director of ALCAP. He's been in that position 18 months or so and doing an outstanding job so far, and we know he'll do so in the future. I've had the privilege of knowing Greg for a while, knew his family, his dad, his grandfather, and he comes from a blessed family, and he's, I know, very proud of that and glad to have that kind of influence in his life. Greg, today is always important. It's the day the Lord has made, and we're to rejoice and be glad in it.
That's right.
But it's a glad day for us to be able to have you with us here and to hear your testimony about what God is doing in your life, has done and is doing and will hopefully be doing, and also hear more about the work of ALCAP. Well, a good number of people in Alabama Baptist life may yet not know the full width and breadth of what you do at ALCAP and what ALCAP represents. Begin, if you will, by just telling us a little bit of your background and a bit of a testimony, if you will, so Alabama Baptists will get to know you better.
Certainly, love to, and thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be a part of this conversation. I am a fourth generation ordained Southern Baptist minister. My great-granddad, my granddad, my dad, who you knew some of them. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how far back you go, but
I don't go back to your great-grandfather.
Okay, we're certainly they were Southern Baptist pastors here in the state of Alabama, and so I tell people I'm Southern Fried Baptist, through and through. Saved at a young age and a blessed family, and haven't always lived perfectly, and certainly have had my faults and struggles over the years, like many do. But really surrendered to the ministry at about age 18. And being Southern Baptist all of my life, but my ministry has really been very multi-denominational with First Priority of Alabama, campus ministry.
Yeah.
We worked with, churches that were just interested in reaching, teenagers for Christ. Right. Mostly Southern Baptist, because that's mostly who's in the state of Alabama. But certainly we always have worked with other evangelical denominations that were evangelistically minded. And so that was kind of neat coming to ALCAP because we primarily represent Southern Baptists, but we do work with people of different denominations, and our legislators are often of different backgrounds. So it's kind of prepared me for it. I did pastor a Southern Baptist church. I was youth pastor as well at a couple of different churches, and then began hosting a radio show here in Alabama. Heard across about half the state back in 2011, Priority Talk. So the Lord has really given me, I have been blessed. I think that was a great word and really opened up a lot of great doors for me that I could have never, ever imagined. And now being with ALCAP is just one of those that I couldn't have planned it out if I'd have wanted to.
For the sake of clarity, would you just tell the audience, some of them know, but many don't, what ALCAP, ALCAP stands for?
And most people don't know, and I always had to ask as well before I took the job.
Right.
It's the Alabama Citizens Action Program, and so citizenship's a big part of that.
Right.
And citizenship is biblical, and it really should be a bigger part of our discipleship. Even how do we live in this world that we are placed in? Our ultimate citizenship, of course, is in heaven. But we relate to the Alabama State Legislature on behalf of Southern Baptist, and that's our state senators and our state representatives. So there's
Alabama Baptist,
particularly, yes, our churches. We're the people that are there, in Montgomery with them. There's 105 state representatives and 35 senators, and our goal is to know every one of them, and to hopefully minister and love on them and share Christ with them, and then also share biblical values with them when it comes to how they legislate.
Right. Well, that's good. And so far, has there been a positive, negative surprise that you'd like to share with the audience?
One thing has just been how well respected ALCAP is in Montgomery. It's very well respected. It goes way back, Dr. Dan Ireland, of course, and then Dr. Godfrey. So I'm just trying to continue what those men had done and the wisdom that they had. So ALCAP, the name is known.
Yes.
People, they recognize, they may not know what it stands for, but they certainly, they know what we stand for. And that's been a real blessing and a real, not a surprise, but something you're very glad to come across.
Yeah, something that you knew was true, but is even more true now that you're in the position.
Yeah.
The ALCAP organization has deep roots in Alabama life, and of course, Alabama Baptist life, going back to the temperance movement, and then later on we had leaders there. I've known some of them even before Darren, Ireland, as a young child, and I've always been keenly interested in what ALCAP does in the ministry. But now we are obviously in a culture that is openly hostile to what we represent as evangelical Christians. And even though we might have very good and open hands and open hearts to us as Alabama Baptists and evangelicals in the state legislature, there are some who are very hostile. So I would imagine working with state legislators on behalf of critical issues of nature that we all embrace, pro-life and a plethora of issues, there might be some resistance even among some of the best of people. One of the main things that ALGAP's had to stand against through the years, and rightfully so, is gambling. Yeah. And now we have a growing interest in embracing it, where at one time we seemed to resist it. So you might want to talk, not in naming names, but in general, how that change came about. I guess it was a generational part of it and a cultural part of it.
Yeah, I think so. And it's just become more normalized, in society overall. And so, there's just a drift that happens. Now, we have a lot of our 140 legislators are not for gambling, on some level. So it's a matter of just finding out exactly where they stand. We know how destructive gambling is, how addictive it is. It's predatory, and so we know the results that come from it, and we know that oftentimes the results of these kind of addictive behaviors wind up right on the front steps of our churches. And while we're happy to help people that are in need, it does take away from our proactive efforts to go out and make disciples.
Yes.
And it drains us. It drains us our resources. It drains our energy. It drains our time to have to deal with people that find themselves in such needless situations. It didn't have to be that way. So I think the normalization of gambling and allowing it to happen here in the state illegally, quite honestly, it's happening, but it's not legal. But the lack of enforcement of the law has really normalized it to the point where people say, I call it normalized to legalize. Mm-hmm. Everybody's doing it, so we might as well go ahead and legalize it so we can control it. And that seems to be now the prevailing thought. Even those who say, I'm not for it, I would vote against it at the ballot, but I'm going to vote for it so the people can vote, or I'm going to vote for it because we need to be able to regulate it and control it. So that's sort of where the argument's at right now. There's just not enough of our people speaking up on the issue. When you're a legislator and all you ever hear are people saying, when we're going to have a lottery, when we're going to have casinos, when we're going to legalize sports betting, when that's all you ever hear, and they tell me they even hear that at church when they go to church. When that's all you ever hear and you don't hear the other side, you just begin to think that's what everybody wants.
Yeah.
And we've got to be a little bit more vocal, I think, and put our values out there.
Through the years, I've gotten the idea that people feel like that if something really doesn't bother them directly, that it's not a problem, when it's the indirect part of it that they don't consider. For instance, when I drive through a neighboring state, I won't name the state, I love it, love the state, have family there, but you'll see an advertisement for a casino, and then about a mile down the road, there'll be one for helping gambling addicts. Yeah. And that is just all the way through that stretch of the interstate, so to speak. And I've thought to myself, we're sending two messages. One, go have fun, gamble, lose valuable money that needs to be helping to feed children and pay bills. Right. And then, but when you do it, we'll help you with it as an addict. So it just seems to be a counterintuitive kind of message going on. And that part of it is just, to me, very obvious when you start seeing the need. And we have an increase in homelessness in America. We have an increase in crime in America. we have an increase in a lot of other evil things happening. And somehow or another, I wonder how people think this won't feed that to make it even worse.
I used that same example yesterday. I was doing a television interview for one of our networks here in the state about gambling. It's, when we're recording this, it's right around football season starting.
Right.
So they were wanting to talk about sports betting.
Yes.
And I used that example. I said, when you have to build in money to help the people who are going to be harmed by this activity, maybe we shouldn't be promoting the activity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive. It really is.
Yeah.
It's not logical.
Well, it really appeals to the most vulnerable and the most who are prone to have addictive personalities. Of course, that's not all that ALCAP does.
No.
ALCAP represents us well in pro-life issues, and Alabama, I heard the Arkansas former governor say Arkansas is the most pro-life state, and I thought to myself, well, I think Alabama would be right up there with you, if not.
Now, our law is certainly stronger than theirs. I think they have a 6-week law when it comes to abortion, and ours is, prior to that.
Right.
And the ALCAP's attorney, wrote that bill.
Right.
That became the law in 2019. So Alabama Baptist support certainly helps make that happen. And we're not solely responsible for it. There's been a lot of people working a long time on this issue, but Alabama had the law in place once Roe v. Wade fell that became the law. And it's the strongest in the nation. Dr. Lance, when I attend national meetings and they start talking about pro-life, it's not uncommon for them to put Alabama right up on the screen, our law, and say, this is the example. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that because we hear a lot of national noise about other states, like you say, and we don't really have anybody out there beating that drum, I think, nationally going, hey, look at us.
Right.
But we have the strongest and I believe the best pro-life law in the country, and it needs to stay the way it is. We don't need to change it. We've got the right law.
I think Alabamians and Alabama Baptists particularly are less flamboyant about things, and we don't go around bragging on ourselves, which I have a deep appreciation for, but I also think at times we ought to be able to state the fact. And
it shows other states follow other states.
Right.
If we bring legislation that's already passed in another state, and you go, hey, they've already done this in this state and this state, it gets instant credibility. Oh, if they've done it, then we can do it. And so I think us having more of a national voice would maybe help other states go, hey, if they can do it, why can't ours all be a little stronger?
Well, we touched on very important 2 key issues. What other issues or concerns you see on the horizon that we need to be thinking about? Religious liberty is one.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to mention. Religious liberty is really big. We keeping the doors of the gospel open.
Right.
We can't just think here in Alabama that we don't have people that would love to restrict, what we enjoy here in our state, which are our churches are very involved in the community and have a public voice. And, there's lots of funding and lots of people that would love to see that restricted. Alabama and Mississippi actually are sort of a target of some national groups that feel like if we can get some of these religious liberty restrictions in those states, it's home free from there. If you can get Alabama and Mississippi, there's nothing you can't conquer. So there's been a lot of money put into our state, and some of this is being fought on the more on the local level with the what's called SOGI laws, or sexual orientation, gender identification, SOGI laws, and these are really more being implemented more on your city level. So I would just encourage everybody in Alabama, talk with your mayors and your city council about religious liberty issues. That's sort of where they're coming.
Right.
And we've seen a couple of municipalities here in the state actually push back on this and defeat it.
Yes.
Just even recently here in our state. And our Alabama Baptist churches and pastors were some of the ones that really led the charge in saying, no, this is not acceptable in our city. So it's not all on the state level. A lot of it is on that city level.
And of course, so, you work with those.
Yeah. We'll work with them best we can, with the resources we have available, we certainly consult. We have consulted with those other 2.
One of the uncomfortable things I've heard most recently in recent years is for some politicians to define what we call religious liberty as freedom of worship, and that is what you do on Sunday morning, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. It's a subtle difference, isn't it?
It's a vast
It's a slippery
difference.
slope, though.
A vast difference. Religious liberty encompasses everything about one's life, being able to be freely, being able to express your faith, and to have that restricted, whether we're talking about in social media or in other ways. I can tell you, and I shouldn't be too specific, but in disaster relief, we can go to some places here in the U.S. where the government wouldn't particularly welcome local government, and maybe state government wouldn't particularly welcome Southern Baptists because their fear of, quote, proselytizing or doing something they might consider to be bordering on hate matters, where they're sharing their faith to the exclusion of someone else. When actually our DR workers are very trained at being able to give a cup of cold water in Jesus' name to the point that the people themselves ask.
Yeah.
And it's not the other way around as much. They're not bulldozers. They're salt and light and trying to help people in a time of need. Which, by the way, reminds me of something I meant to mention initially. Your predecessor had a sermon, and I've forgotten the title of it, but he began with a great commandment, that is John 13, and talking about loving your neighbor as you loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And then the great commandment, we all know that very well. And then he talked about something else. He called it using salt and light. And I said to him,
The forgotten commandment.
The forgotten
He
commandment.
talks about, the two, and then he says, but there's a third, and it's be salt and light. And he says, that's the forgotten commandment.
Well, I told him that you have he called it I've forgotten what he called the John 13 passage. He called it something else. And the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. And then I said salt and light ought to be the Great Calling. And he started using that, and I thought that was a good contribution. I'm sorry to be a little immodest here, but that's the way my mind
Well,
thinks.
I will tell you on our website, that whole series, he did a whole series during COVID on the forgotten, on that series, but he calls it the Forgotten Commandment.
Right.
And it would be an excellent resource for any of our churches for a Wednesday night Bible study or something. Really good. And he talks about a lot of the issues of citizenship.
He has a name, by the way. That's Joe Godfrey.
That's right.
I should have mentioned that. I just said predecessor. So we are, and he's still active, folks. He's out in churches serving as an interim pastor now. And
hasn't been a whole lot of days I haven't had some communication with him in my new role, and certainly no weeks I haven't been in communication.
Right.
And so he's still been very, very helpful to us.
Yeah, that's good.
He's still got a lot to give.
Well, you're standing on some tall shoulders going way back, and we know that you'll also have shoulders in which someone in the future will be able to stand upon.
Dr. Lance, I remember when I was a teenager, I remember Dr. Ireland, led the ministry for 30 years.
Yes.
I remember him coming to our church and preaching and speaking. He'd come over to the house and have lunch. My dad was the pastor.
Right.
And I remember thinking, man, I'm glad somebody does that. What he does,
right?
And having no idea that I would, fall into that role one day. So it's
and every one of them that I've known, and I've known more than I'd like to admit, each one of them had a different kind of contribution to make in their personalities and all that. But Dan had a way of being a chaplain, Dan Ireland, a chaplain to the state legislators. He'd be at their funerals and be at the time of death of people, and so he just had a winsome way. One of the things I learned from Dan, just watching him with politicians, not that I have to do it because that's more your work, but I do have to relate in some ways, is that you don't want to get mad at them on this issue and hold a grudge because you'll need them on something else down the road.
That's right.
So Dan was very good at that, and I think that's a good role model to have because politics is politics. It's swimming with sharks and maybe worse.
Yeah. Well, and I tell you, we still continue a lot of what he did. He started the ALCAP prayer breakfast back in 1981, and we relaunched that this past spring in 23, coming out of COVID.
Right.
And it still went very well. We had in the 30s and 40s in attendance every single week at it, and so it's still just a wonderful ministry. And some of the guys have been involved for a long time, but we had a lot of the newly elected legislators get involved this year as well, which was very encouraging.
Well, Alabama Baptists will understand this terminology, and evangelical Christians who study Scripture will know we're in spiritual warfare.
Sure.
And we have to realize that life is a battleground in many ways, trying to deal with, you might call the forces of evil, because this world is hostile. It's a fallen world. We have to recognize that. And sometimes we default into either two directions: utopia, and some people who are partisan feel like we can have what we would call heaven right here on earth, create the perfect society, which is, I guess that's a good thing to think about, but it's impossible.
Not realistic.
And then for some of us in evangelical circles, we can actually gravitate toward a dystopia where we feel like, man, this is awful, and we're living right now with a kind of earthly apocalypse that we're having to deal with, and it's almost like the virus has overcome everyone. And so somewhere in the middle we operate, trying to realize that we're citizens of heaven, trying to be good citizens here and recognize our dual citizenship. And you guys at ALCAP, through the history of ALCAP, have done an excellent job in helping Alabama Baptists and other evangelicals understand that role by being salt and light in the society. All of us have to depend upon the Lord because He's sovereign, but we also want to be usable in His service. And
well, what you said is right, because I tell people, I say, it's not about me being in the State House or at the Capitol. It's about who I represent. And first of all, I represent Christ and the gospel.
Right.
But then I represent our churches. And I'm really no more effective than the people I represent. I'm one person. But when we mobilize and when the legislators know who I represent, then it does give you more influence. It certainly does.
Yeah. Well, you've done a good job of that and already made good headway with the legislators, as far as I can tell. And I think I heard nothing but good reports. Your board is behind you.
Yes,
and
they
there
are.
is a board at ALCAP, folks, made up of mainly pastors from many denominations, but mostly, I guess.
Mostly Southern Baptist.
Alabama Baptists here, so that's good. And Greg, if you were to think about, real briefly, if you were thinking about the future of ALCAP, what you would like it to look like 5 years from now, what would that be?
Well, we need more feet on the ground. I've said it a time or two, I'm one person, and it's a big state. And there's a lot of churches to inform and educate and get mobilized. There's, like I said, 140 legislators from every nook and cranny of the state, and you're one person. So, if I had, the dream, it would be that we would have multiple other people like me in different parts of the state who maybe are from that part of the state and have lots of relationships and know people and know the legislators and know the pastors and can relate to them on a little closer level. It sure helps when you can see people Friday night at a ball game, or you can see them at Jack's on Saturday morning getting a biscuit. And I don't get that except for right where I live. So just having other people that are gifted in these areas, I think getting up every day and working on influencing morality and biblical values here in our state would be so helpful. More feet on the ground is certainly needed.
No, that's good. That's a good vision, mobilizing all of us in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I always like to ask our guests, how can we pray for you? And if you have a specific way you'd like for us as an audience of supporters and co-laborers, how can we pray for you?
Yeah, well, I tell people, I get this a lot. Everywhere I go, people, pastors, when I meet with them, they want to pray for you, and that is so needed. Protection, I think, is a big key, spiritual protection.
Right.
We have to be very careful. Our testimony, our witness.
Sure.
We deal with a lot of issues, and people just love to see you, get you in a compromising position, so you lose your credibility.
Right.
And we all deal with that in ministry, of course.
Absolutely.
But that, and then just being out here on the roads, like you, we're traveling all these roads across the state of Alabama, and
believe me, I know.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I haven't been anywhere you hadn't been. And so that's a big issue as well. And then just, the support of our churches is so key, that more would get involved with their influence, even supporting financially, and just, just going, hey, how can we make a difference here in our community? That's needed, because, again, we're a small organization. Well, I hope we have a big influence, but organizationally, we're very small. It's really about the 33 or 3,400 churches that we represent. That's where our influence is.
Well, yeah, you may be a mustard seed, but you have a mountain of influence.
That's right.
I might say that one thing I say to all leaders, and I say about myself, we need wisdom giving us discernment for living these days. And one little observation, it's a kind of a leadership principle, yet it doesn't come across that way. I have long since tried not to live in my comfort zone. It's impossible. What you want to do when you're dealing with issues is try to get at peace with it, the strategy you have and what you're facing, because you know it's never comfortable. It's always going to be uncomfortable. But when you deal with those critical things, you try to get at peace with what you're trying to do. And I think that's where you'll be.
Well, we certainly do, because we have an ideal of how we'd like things to be, but sometimes it's not realistic. You're not going to get there all at once.
Well, if this country operated the way I wanted it to, it would not go over very well.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. And so, sometimes people can even get upset with us and go, well, you compromised on this or that or whatever. It's like, no, we went for all of it, but sometimes you have to take the victories you can get, and then live to fight another day.
Every football team has to celebrate first downs, touchdowns in order to have victories. And it's not, some games are going to be sloppy and close, and that's life, and that's also the work and ministry you and I both are in. Thank you again, audience, for being so attentive to One Mission, the podcast. And we are going to be praying for Greg Davis, who's done an exemplary job in these 18 months. He's following in the footsteps of some giants of faith, but he too will have that kind of influence across Alabama. We thank you again, Greg.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor.
Be praying for you and your family.
Thank you.
And God bless you.
Yes, you too.